All right, everybody, straight into it. No delays, no fluff. We've got breaking news out of Mexico and Central America right now. A powerful earthquake has struck off the Pacific coast of southern Mexico, right near the Guatemala border, and it triggered a tsunami warning for both countries. This happened Friday morning, July 17th, 2026. Let's get you every fact we have. The earthquake struck at around 7:48 a.m. Pacific time, roughly 8:48 a.m. Central time. The epicenter was about 30 miles southwest of Aquiles Cerdán, Mexico, in the southern state of Chiapas, close to the Guatemala border. Depth estimates vary slightly by source, some reporting around 6 miles, others closer to 9 or 15 miles down. That's a shallow to moderate depth, and that matters, because shallower quakes tend to produce stronger shaking at the surface. The magnitude was first reported as a 7.4. Within a short time, the U.S. Geological Survey revised that down to a 7.3. That kind of revision is completely normal in the first hour or two after a big quake. Initial readings come from limited seismic stations, and the number gets refined as more data comes in. So don't get confused by the back and forth between 7.3 and 7.4 you might see across different outlets. Both numbers came from the same event. The official settled figure is 7.3. And here's why that tenth of a point actually matters. The magnitude scale is logarithmic, not linear. Each whole number increase represents roughly 32 times more energy released, not just a bit more. Even a difference like 7.3 versus 7.4 represents a real jump in energy, something in the range of 40% more. So when USGS revises a number down, they're not just tweaking a label, they're refining the actual physical measurement of how much energy came out of the Earth at that spot. Because the quake happened offshore, in the ocean, it had the potential to displace enough water to generate a tsunami. That's why the U.S. Tsunami Warning System issued an alert almost immediately, covering coastal areas of Mexico and Guatemala within about 186 miles of the epicenter. Now here's the part everybody wants to know. Was this actually a tsunami or just a warning? As of the last update, the tsunami threat was issued and then canceled a few hours later. Officials in Mexico said they weren't expecting a serious event. Mexico's Secretary of the Navy. I said publicly that water levels weren't expected to rise more than about half a meter, and that there was no serious maritime impact expected. Just some beaches potentially seeing a modest rise in water level. Still, he told people to stay away from the beaches as a precaution while the situation was being monitored. Separately, the Meteorological Service of Chiapas put out its own estimate, warning that waves as high as about 3.3 feet could hit parts of the Mexican and Guatemalan coastline. That's higher than the Navy's number, and that's normal. Different agencies use different models in the first few hours after an event like this. Local officials in the border town of Suchiate, which sits along the river separating Mexico and Guatemala, said they were monitoring coastal conditions purely as a precaution. Let me walk you through how these warnings actually get issued, because there's a lot of confusion out there about what a warning means versus an advisory or a watch. When a large earthquake happens under or near the ocean, monitoring agencies look at three things almost instantly. The magnitude, the depth, and whether the type of fault movement involved is the kind that displaces water vertically. A shallow offshore quake with the right kind of fault motion gets treated as a real potential tsunami source within minutes, long before anyone can confirm whether a wave has actually formed. That's exactly what happened here. Buoys and coastal tide gauges in the region get monitored in real time after that. If those instruments start showing unusual wave activity, the warning gets escalated. If they don't, and enough time passes without unusual readings, the warning gets downgraded and eventually canceled, which is exactly what happened a few hours after this quake. Bottom line on the tsunami, no waves of significant size were confirmed to have hit. The alert was a precaution based on the size and location of the quake, and it was lifted a few hours after being issued. Now let's talk about where the shaking was actually felt, because this wasn't confined to one small area. Strong shaking was reported across a wide stretch of southern Mexico and northern Central America. In Mexico, the states of Chiapas and Oaxaca both felt strong tremors. In Tuxtla Gutierrez, the capital of Chiapas, people in the city's taller buildings described real panic during the shaking. One government employee working in a 15-story building said the sensation up there felt genuinely awful. And that makes sense, because sway gets amplified the higher up you are in a building during an earthquake. In Tapachula, one of the largest Mexican cities close to the Guatemalan border, residents also felt strong shaking. Mexico City felt some sway in buildings too, but officials there said the capital's seismic alert system did not activate because the energy released didn't cross the threshold that system uses to trigger a public alert. In Guatemala, the shaking prompted people to evacuate buildings, including a government building in Guatemala City, where staff were seen leaving as part of standard emergency protocol. One resident there, a 29-year-old accountant living on the 8th floor of his building, described running down the stairs because the shaking wouldn't stop. and said it brought back memories of the recent Venezuela earthquakes. Another resident, a customer service worker on the third floor, said he sheltered on Mio and Gaminai. Dara's structural support column as the building shook, and that memories of Venezuela's disaster were on his mind too. That's worth sitting with for a second. Even when a quake doesn't end up causing major structural damage, it can still be a deeply frightening experience for the people living through it, especially against the backdrop of a region that has now watched multiple serious earthquakes hit neighboring countries within a matter of weeks. In El Salvador, the earthquake was felt strongly as well, including in the capital, San Salvador, where people evacuated buildings such as the National Library. No deaths or damage were reported there. The country's Ministry of Environment also noted a smaller, separate earthquake off the coast of the Usulután department around the same time. So what's actually confirmed on casualties and damage? As of the most recent reporting, there have been no confirmed deaths and no reports of significant structural damage in Mexico, Guatemala, or El Salvador. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum said preliminary as assessments showed no significant damage. That doesn't mean nothing happened on the ground. Aftershocks and some landslides have been reported in the region. But as of right now, this has not turned into a mass casualty event the way some other recent earthquakes have. This is still an evolving story, and assessments like this often get updated in the hours and days that follow, especially in more rural or harder to reach areas near the epicenter. Authorities didn't wait around on precautions. Guatemala's Ministry of Education suspended in-person classes in 4 departments closest to the epicenter: San Marcos, Quetzaltenango, Suchitepeques, and Retalhuleu. That's a standard move after a strong quake. Get kids out of school buildings and assess structural safety before resuming normal operations. Mexico's Navy also urged people to stay away from beaches for at least 6 hours following the quake, specifically because of the tsunami risk. Coastal towns like Suchiate had officials actively monitoring conditions. A quake this size doesn't happen in isolation. A series of aftershocks followed, including several in the magnitude 5 to 6 range, felt across Mexico, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Seismic monitoring also picked up a smaller earthquake that occurred before the main shock, with its own epicenter located farther offshore, Esenu. Clearly a foreshock that preceded the bigger event. If you're in the region, expect aftershocks to continue for some time. That's completely normal after a quake of this magnitude. The surrounding fault system needs to redistribute stress, and that process doesn't happen instantly. Smaller aftershocks, sometimes numbering in the dozens or more, can continue for days or even weeks. Now let's talk about why this happened here in the first place, because this quake didn't come out of nowhere. It happened along the Pacific Ring of Fire, a roughly 25,000-mile belt that traces the edges of the Pacific Ocean through South America, up through Mexico and north. America, across into Alaska, down through Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and out to New Zealand. This belt accounts for a huge share of the world's earthquake and volcanic activity, and there's real science behind why. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, roughly 80% of the world's largest earthquakes occur within this zone. The reason comes down to plate tectonics. The Ring of Fire is lined with subduction zones, places where one tectonic plate is forced underneath another. Southern Mexico specifically sits near the boundary where the Cocos Plate is subducting beneath the North American Plate. That ongoing collision builds up stir, as over years and decades, and when it releases, you get an earthquake. When that release happens under the ocean floor, you also get the potential for a tsunami, because the sudden vertical movement of the seafloor displaces massive amounts of water above it. This is also why you'll often hear about earthquakes and tsunami alerts happening in clusters in different countries within the same general window of time. It's not because they're seeing each other directly across thousands of miles. It's because the entire Ring of Fire is one enormous interconnected system of tectonic stress, and different segments of it can become active independently, sometimes within days of each other, just because that's where the geological pressure happens to be building at any given time. Let me give you the full picture of just how active this stretch has been for the Ring of Fire, because this earthquake is just the latest in a long string of events. Venezuela was hit by twin earthquakes on June 24th, magnitude 7.2 and 7.5, striking less than a minute apart in the north-central region of the country. The damage was severe. Buildings collapsed in Caracas and nearby coastal areas, and the death toll has been reported at over 235 people, with hundreds more injured. Venezuela doesn't actually sit on the Pacific Ring of Fire. It's vulnerable because it sits near the boundary between the Caribbean Plate and the South American Plate, but the timing of these events, all within weeks of each other, has understandably put people on edge. U.S. forces have continued providing disaster relief assistance there in the aftermath, and recovery efforts are still ongoing. The Philippines got hit with a devastating magnitude 7.8 earthquake on June 8th. At least 61 people were killed, with buildings collapsing and widespread damage reported. Later in June, A magnitude 6.5 quake struck the same general area off the southern coast of Mindanao. Japan saw a magnitude 5.7 quake near Oshino. Felt as far as Tokyo, though no damage was reported, and a magnitude 6.9 quake in Kamaishi around the same period. Nicaragua also felt a notable quake during that same active stretch. And just one day before this Mexico quake, a strong earthquake rattled New Zealand's South Island, triggering its own tsunami alert, which was lifted without major incident. And worth mentioning for scale, back in 2025, the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia was struck by a massive magnitude 8.7 to 8.8 megathrust earthquake, one of the most powerful earthquakes recorded anywhere in the world since 2011. It generated tsunami waves, reported over 30 meters in some areas, and was felt across He Pacific Basin. That event is part of why there's been so much public attention on Ring of Fire activity ever since. It was a genuine reminder of how much energy this system can release. And just to put that in perspective, an 8.7 or 8.8 isn't just a bit stronger than a 7.3. It's on the order of hundreds of times more powerful in terms of energy release. That's part of why Kamchatka generated waves over 30 meters high in some spots, while this Mexico-Guatemala event is looking at a projected rise of well under a meter along most of the coastline. So add it all up, Kamchatka's massive quake, the Philippines' deadly 7.8, Venezuela's catastrophic twin quakes, activity in Japan and Nicaragua, New Zealand's quake and tsunami alert just one day earlier, and now this 7.3 off Mexico and Guatemala. It's been an unusually active stretch. That's a fact, and it's exactly why people are paying closer attention to every new alert that comes across the wire. Now let's go straight at the theories that always come up after something like this, because you'll see them everywhere in the comments. Some people are saying the sun is causing this, that solar flares and coronal mass ejections are somehow triggering tectonic plate movement. Here's the straightforward answer. There is no established mechanism in mainstream geophysics that links solar activity to plate tectonics or earthquake triggering. Earthquakes are driven by the slow buildup and sudden release of stress along tectonic plate boundaries, a process that unfolds over years, decades, and centuries, driven by heat and movement deep within the Earth's mantle, not by anything happening on the surface of the sun. Clusters of earthquakes across the globe happen because the entire Ring of Fire and the planet's fault systems generally are always under some degree of stress, and multiple regions can become active independently within a short window purely by geological coincidence. Other people are saying this is man-made, secret nuclear tests, weather manipulation. These claims come up after nearly every major earthquake, and they are not supported by seismological evidence. Earthquakes of this magnitude release heat energy on a scale that isn't consistent with underground testing or any known weather modification technology. Seismologists can actually tell the difference between the seismic signature of a nuclear test and a natural earthquake. The wave patterns are different, and no such signature has been reported here. And then there's the old one, that California is going to fall into the ocean. This has been around for decades, and it isn't physically possible. California is not going to break off and sink into the Pacific. What is true is that California sits on and near the San Andreas fault system, a boundary between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate, and it does experience regular seismic activity. Scientists have long discussed the likelihood of a major damaging earthquake at some point on that fault system, often called the Big One, but that refers to a large earthquake causing serious damage in populated areas, not the state detaching from the continent and disappearing under the waves. Is the Big One a real risk for California? Yes, in the sense that a major earthquake on the San Andreas Fault, or related fault systems, is considered a matter of when, not if, over a long enough time frame. Fault segments build up stress between major ruptures, and some segments haven't released significant stress in a long time. But IFIC predictions about timing aren't something science can currently deliver. Nobody can give you a date. What experts consistently recommend instead is preparedness, securing heavy furniture, keeping emergency supplies on hand, knowing evacuation routes if you're near a coast, and having a family communication plan ready. Is this connected to the Kamchatka earthquake from last year? Not directly. They're both part of the same Ring of Fire system, but they happened on different fault segments, thousands of miles apart, months apart. There's no established way for one to trigger the other across that kind of distance and time gap. They're best understood as separate releases of stress within the same broad tectonic belt, not a chain reaction. Could this earthquake have been predicted in advance? No. Despite decades of research, scientists still can't predict the exact time, location, and magnitude of an earthquake before it happens. What they can do is identify which regions carry elevated long-term risk based on fault history and stress buildup, which is why places like the Chiapas-Guatemala border, the San Andreas Fault, and the subduction zones off Japan and the Philippines are consistently flagged as high-risk zones. That's a statement about long-term probability, not a specific forecast. Is California at greater risk right now because of this quake? No direct connection has been established between this event and seismic risk in California. The fault systems involved are completely separate. California's earthquake risk is an ongoing, long-term reality tied to its own local fault systems, independent of what happens off the coast of southern Mexico. Should people cancel travel plans to the region right now? As of the latest reporting, there's no active state of emergency, no confirmed deaths, and no significant confirmed damage. Airports and major infrastructure haven't been reported as affected. Anyone with imminent travel plans should still check official government and airline advisories directly, since local conditions can change as assessments continue. One more thing worth explaining. In events like this, video and photos from residents on the ground almost always hit social media well before mainstream outlets have official confirmation of casualties or damage. That's just how information moves now. People experiencing the event post it in real time, while news organizations wait on official statements from governments and agencies like USGS before publishing hard numbers. That's why you'll see GE of shaking buildings and rock slides circulating within the first hour, while headlines are still using words like preliminary and no immediate reports of damage. Both things can be true at once, real footage of real shaking, and a genuinely low confirmed casualty count so far. Give it time for the full picture to come in, and don't assume video footage alone tells you the full scale of what happened. Let's talk about what actually happens next in the response process, because even without confirmed deaths or major damage, there's a standard process that unfolds after an earthquake of this size, and it's useful to know what to expect in the coming days. First comes rapid structural assessment. Engineers and local officials in skeeting schools, government buildings, hospitals, and other public infrastructure near the epicenter, checking for hidden damage that isn't visible from the outside. That's exactly why Guatemala suspended in-person classes. In the 4 departments closest to the epicenter, it buys time for that inspection process to happen safely without students and staff inside those buildings while it's underway. Second is aftershock monitoring, which can continue for days or weeks. Seismologists keep tracking the sequence, watching for whether the aftershocks gradually decrease in frequency and size, which is the normal pattern, or whether anything unusual shows up that would suggest a need for further alerts. Third is the broader tsunami monitoring window. Even after the initial warning gets canceled, coastal monitoring in the region typically continues at a lower level of attention for a period of time, just to make sure no delayed wave activity shows up as the situation continues to settle. And fourth, on the humanitarian side, this is when local and sometimes international relief organizations begin doing rapid need assessments in the immediate area, checking whether anyone lost housing, whether utilities were disrupted, and whether any communities need direct support, even in the absence of a large confirmed death toll. That process is often quieter and less visible than headline coverage, but it's an important part of what happens after an event like this moves out of the news cycle. If you strip away the speculation, here's the actual guidance coming from officials in the affected region right now. Stay away from beaches and low-lying coastal areas for several hours after a quake like this, until tsunami threats are confirmed cleared by local authorities, not by whatever's circulating on social media. Expect aftershocks, and don't be alarmed by smaller tremors following the main quake. That's a normal part of the process, and it doesn't mean a bigger one is coming. If you're in a tall building during G-shaking, get to a doorway, a sturdy interior wall, or under solid furniture, and stay away from windows. Schools and government buildings in the immediate region are being assessed before returning to normal operations, which is why Guatemala suspended classes. In the closest departments as a precaution, and if you have family or friends in southern Mexico, Guatemala, or El Salvador, this is a good time to check in with them directly rather than relying only on secondhand reports or viral clips. It's also worth zooming out for a second on why this particular stretch of coastline is such a well-known earthquake zone in the first place, beyond just the general ring of fire explanation. The sea, Ocos Plate, the oceanic plate sitting off the Pacific coast of southern Mexico and Central America, is constantly being forced underneath the North American and Caribbean plates along a subduction boundary that runs the length of the region. That process doesn't happen smoothly. The plates lock together due to friction, stress builds up over years, and then releases suddenly when the friction finally gives way. That's what an earthquake actually is, sudden release of built-up stress along that boundary. This particular stretch, near Chiapas and the Guatemala border, has a long documented history of significant earthquakes. For exactly that reason, it's one of the more active subduction segments along the entire Central American coastline. Something else worth mentioning, because people often ask about it after events like this, earthquakes and volcanic activity are connected in this region, but that doesn't mean this earthquake is a sign of imminent volcanic activity. The same subduction process that produces earthquakes along the Ring of Fire also produces the magma that feeds many of the volcanoes in Mexico and Central America, which is part of why the belt is called the Ring of Fire in the first place. But a single earthquake of this size on its own is not treated by volcanologists as a specific predictive signal for a particular volcano erupting. Volcanic monitoring in the region continues independently of this event, using its own separate set of instruments and indicators. Let's bring it all together. A 7.3 magnitude earthquake struck off the Pacific coast of Chiapas, Mexico, near the Guatemala border at roughly 7:48 a.m. Pacific time on Friday, July 17th, 2026. It was initially reported as a 7.4 before USGS revised it to 7.3. The epicenter was about 30 miles southwest of Aquiles, Cerdán, Mexico, at a depth estimated between roughly 6 and 15 miles, depending on the source. A tsunami warning was issued for coastal areas of Mexico and Guatemala within about 186 miles of the epicenter, and it was canceled a few hours later. Strong shaking was felt in Chiapas, Oaxaca, Mexico City, Guatemala City, Tapachula, Tuxtla Gutierrez, and San Salvador. No deaths and no significant damage have been confirmed as of the latest reports. Guatemala suspended in-person classes in 4 departments near the epicenter as a precaution. Mexico's Navy advised people to stay off beaches for at least 6 hours. Aftershocks in the magnitude to 5 to 6 range have continued to hit the region. This event is part of a broader, unusually active stretch for the Pacific Ring of Fire, following major quakes in Venezuela, the Philippines, Japan, Nicaragua, and New Zealand over the past several weeks. And claims linking solar activity, secret nuclear tests, or weather manipulation to this earthquake are not supported by established science. That's everything confirmed as of right now. This is still a developing story, and if new information comes in, updated casualty figures, damage assessments, or further aftershocks, we'll bring you that the moment it's confirmed. For now, the situation appears to be stabilizing. The tsunami threat has passed, no deaths have been reported, and authorities across Mexico, Guatemala, and El Salvador are in the assessment phase rather than emergency response phase. If you've got family or friends in the region, reach out to them directly, and stay tuned for updates as this story continues to develop. One last thing before we close this out. Events like this tend to generate a wave of misinformation almost as fast as they generate real news, so it's worth repeating the core discipline here. Trust the agencies actually doing the measuring, USGS for the seismic data, the U.S. Tsunami Warning System and National Meteorological Services for the wave threat, and local government statements for casualty and damage figures. Treat viral claims about causes, whether it's the sun, secret weapons testing, or anything else without a documented mechanism, with real skepticism until there's actual evidence behind them. It's not about dismissed, seeing people's fear or curiosity. It's about giving you the tools to separate what's confirmed from what's speculation while a story is still moving fast. We'll keep tracking this one and bring you the next update as soon as there's something new to report.